discussed in last weeks. So even though we can define or we can restrict some kind of usage within XML DTD, there are some things that we can't achieve, or some more things that we can't do with DTD, like we can't define the data type, whether it's integer, string, or boolean, or whatever. So there are things like that we can't actually do with XML DTD. So as a replacement for XML DTD, or as the next version, as the successor of XML DTD, we can find this XML schema. So XML DTD means data type definitions. Schema means XSD. The previous one is DTD. This is XSD. XSD means XML schema definition, right? So yes, so these things we did during our last sessions, right? Use case scenarios, and we did some practicals too. And moving ahead, we learned that there are these disadvantages or limitations of XML DTD, right? DTD is describe only the grammar of the XML file, not the detailed structure or types, right? So it just defines the grammar, how to use this file, how to validate this file, but not any detailed structure like data types, what are the restrictions that we have, what are the element names that we can use, those things, or what are the data types that we can use within these elements. We can't define them with XML DTD, right? This grammatical description has some obvious shortcomings. Right? As an example, we cannot express that a length element must contain a non-negative number, right? Always the length is the positive number. Length is minus, right? Length is never going to be a minus value. It's always a plus value or positive value. So in that case, we can't express this length element that it should have non-negative number or positive number, right? So we can't define such things, right? The unit element should only be allowed when amount is present, right? The comment element should be allowed to appear anywhere, right? So likewise, there are these kind of disadvantages or shortcomings in XML DTD. To overcome this, we have XML schema or XML XSD schema definition, right? So there are two types, complex types and simple types, right? And built-in and user-defined types, right? So as an example, now if it is a user-defined data type, that is always a complex type, right? And there are two types. We are going to learn what are these simple types and what are these complex types when it comes to XML schema. Elements have complex types or simple types. Attributes have simple types. So attributes always have simple types. So you know, now you know the difference between an element and an attribute, right? Tag attribute event. So type of root element of a document is global. Downward compatible, that means backwards compatible. Schemas are XML documents. Namespaces are part of XML schemas, right? So this is a sample XML schema, right? Or schema definition, right? So let's learn what is this thing means, right? So here we can see let's start with data types, right? So here you can see element name is title, type is string, right? So in that case, this is a simple type, right? So it is simple type. Example for a simple type. So this string is this title element is belonging to simple type, right? And then we have complex types, which is user defined, right? So, and we have sequences, right? We have many things. So we are going to learn what are these things. So here we can see XML schema, and there's a XML schema definition, or XSD, XML schema definition. And that is pointed towards this w3.org 2001 XML schema. So what is this? Right? So this is the XML schema definition that we are going to use to have our data types, right? So all this string, sequence, these data types are defined in this w3.org 2001 XML schema document. So this is a standard, right? We standard එක අපි use කරනවා කියන්නේ අපි මෙන්න මේ line එක use කරලා තියෙනවා, right? So as you can see, it says here schema in a separate XML document, right? So this is schema is defined in a separate XML document, right? So vocabulary of schema is defined in a special namespace. Prefix XSD is commonly used, right? There's a schema for schemas, right? So you might find this is a bit confusing at the moment, right? So when you're moving forward, when you're going to learn these things, you will see this is simple as DTD, right? Make a DTD, even though now you feel this is a bit complex, right? This is simple as DTD, right? So now when it comes to XML document, if we are using XML schema, right? The root node of the document, or the root element of the document, is always this schema element, right? So schema element is always the root, right? Apart from that, there is a schema for schemas also, right? When we are going to define a schema, there's a separate schema for schemas also, right? So there's a schema for schemas also. Schema is not standard. Schema වලට අපේ තියෙන standard එක, right? So right. Moving forward, right. So here, this XSD defines an element here, right? And the element type, the name of the element is book. Up here, like we define that DTD. When you're defining a element, we just use that element tag and then the name of the element, those things. So similarly, we are going to define an element with this one, right? Instead of that, අපි අරක use කරේ මොකක්ද? Right? In DTD, we use something like this, right? And then element like this, no? So in that case, here in this one, in XSD, we don't use that exclamation mark and then element. So here you have to use this data type called or the schema type called XSD, and the type of the element that we are going to use. Now this is an element and the name of the element is book and the type of the element is book type, right? So this book type means this is a user defined what you call this is a user defined data type, right? Make a built-in data type tag, make a user defined data type. So built-in data types are string, integer, boolean, floating point. Those things are built-in data types. So this is book type is a user defined data type, right? So yes, right. So this is a user defined complex type, right? So there are two types of data types when it comes to XML schemas. First one is simple type and the second one is complex type. Simple type doesn't have any child elements or child attributes or anything. It's the last one. But when it comes to complex types, it always have children like this. Now this book type, the complex type called book type, have sequences, right? So user-defined complex type defines sequence of sub-elements. So it has a sequence of sub-elements. Attribute name specifies the type of element. So type is a complex type, book type, right? This type definition is global. Type can be used in any other definition also, right? So this is a simple type, right? So that means there are no sub-elements, right? Making person sub-elements, no child elements. This doesn't have any child elements, right? Local element declaration within a complex type. So simple type means a local element declaration within a complex element. So there can be multiple single or simple types defined within this book type complex element, right? So this title cannot be a root element of documents, right? So simple element can never be a root element of a document, right? So name type as before. XML string is built-in type of XML schema, right? XSD string. Now this here the data type is book type, that is user defined, but here XSD string is built-in type of XML schema, that is a built-in data type, right? So we have things like this. So there are some theoretical parts too, but I feel like we should go ahead with some practical approach. So I'm moving to some examples with W3 schools. So I thought of going forward with these W3 schools practicals because the examples are really good rather than preparing my own slides. So when you go to W3 schools, you can see this XML schema tutorial, right? So it says XML schema describes the structure of an XML document. The XML schema language is also referred as XML Schema Definition or XSD, right? So the purpose of this XML schema is to define the legal building blocks of an XML document, right? So the elements and attributes that can appear in a document, right? The number of and order of child element, data types for elements and attributes, default and fixed values for elements and attributes. Right. So here you can see this is a example XSD, right? So here it's it says the XML namespace is this schema, right? So if you go to this link, when you go to this link, you can see the standard is defined here. The XML standard is defined here, right? So this is the XML schema that we are going to use for our XML definition, right? So you can see what are the elements that we can use, what are the complex types, what are the data types, everything is defined here, right? So what we are going to do here is we are going to get what you call another schema defined in somewhere else, right? So this w3.org is the standardizing organization for web-based applications. So this w3.org defines the standard for XML schema. So we are going to use that XML schema from this w3.org site, which is for XML schema, right? And we are going to use that schema from w3.org, and we are going to define our own XML schema for our applications. We can XML schema data types use karala. Apitama application XML schema define karanna, right? So we are basically reusing a XML schema defined by this w3.org, which is the standardizing organization for websites, right? So here we say at the start of this document, here we say we are going to use this XML Schema Standard, which is the 2001 standard from w3.org, right? So the element name is not, right? And it is a complex type. This complex type has sequences, right? So this not has 2. That means to whom we are sending this not. And we have this from. Who is sending this document or who is sending this not. So this XML document is a not. So to means the person who is intended to receive this document or the person who we are sending this document. From means who is sending this document, right? And the heading of the document and the body, right? So here we have defined the data types, right? So this is XML schema element, right? So we are using the element type from this schema. Element right? And the element name is 2, and the element data type is string, right? Here again we have element name is from, data type is string, heading similar, right? So these are this excess string. This string this is a simple type, and this not is a complex type, right? So in this XML world, hundreds of standardized XML formats are daily in use. Many of these XML standards are defined by XML schema, right? So XML schema is an XML-based and more powerful alternative to DTD, right? So this is a more powerful alternative to DTD, right? DTD means data type definition that we did last week, right? So XML schemas use XML syntax. We discussed this already. Right. When sending data from a sender to a receiver, it is essential that both parties have same expectation about the content, right? That means we should have a standard, right? So, okay. So likewise, we have to define the XML schema definition, and we have to validate it with the validator and make sure it works fine. So moving forward, this is a simple XML document, right? Not we are writing this to this person, and this is written by this person. Heading is reminder. Body is don't forget me this week. Right? So this is a sample note, right? And if we write a DTD for this sample note, it is here, right? The note has these 4 elements, 2 from heading body, right? Note has 2 from heading body. We did this last week, and this 2 is past character data. From is again past character data. Heading is past character data. Body is again past character data. So this is a DTD. If we validate with this with the XML data validator, it will probably say this is passed. There are no errors found, like we did in last week. Right? So the first line defines the note element have 4 child elements, right? So you already know this because we did 4 examples as I remember last week. So this is a example XML schema file called note.xsd that define the element of XML document above. AKA XML schema definition, right? So here XML schema or XML namespace is this one. The target namespace is this one, right? So moving forward, we can see the elements here. Element 2 from heading and body, and the root element is not, right? Let's see what are these tags in XML schema document. So as we learned earlier in the PowerPoint slideshow that I showed you earlier, XML schema element is the root element of every XML schema, right? So you have to keep in mind that XML schema means another XML document, right? XML schema is XML document. So you have to keep that in mind. So in that XML schema XML document, that particular XML document, the new XML document that we are talking about, schema is the root element, right? In this new XML document, schema is the root element, right? So this schema element may contain some attributes. A schema declaration often looks something like this, right? So this XML schema or the root element, this has some sort of attributes, right? So if I open up a notepad, I hope you can see this document, notepad. So XML, now you have to keep in mind, when it comes to XML schema, you have to have a separate document to define XML schema, right? You are not going to use it like DTD. DTD internally define karanna puluwan. What are the elements that we are going to use? But when it comes to XML schema, you need to have a separate document for that. So here I'm defining the XML schema document. So this is a separate XML document as I told you, right? So in this XML schema XML document, the root element is going to be this XS schema, right? In this XML schema document, every time the root element should be XML or XS schema, right? So this schema element may contain some attributes, right? Which looks like this, right? So first of all, we are going to use this XML NS, right? And we are going to link it to this w3.org, right? So let's see what is this XML NS and XS means, right? May mudimma define karpu XML NS XS කියන එකේ තේරුම මොකක්ද? What is the meaning of this, right? So this indicates that the element and its data types used in this schema comes from this namespace, right? So it also specifies that the elements and data types that comes from this particular schema namespace should be prefixed with XS, right? So what does it say, right? So basically, this is the meaning of this, right? So this is an XML schema document. So when it comes to XML schema document, there has to be some sort of standard, right? The data types, the element names, the attribute names, everything, there should be some sort of standardization, right? And that standardization is set by w3.org, right? So this is the w3.org's XML schema standardization. So once you visit this link, as I showed you earlier, you can see the standardization for XML schemas, right? So here we are telling the browser that we are using XML NS, the namespace is XML standard, right? And what does this part say? So it says, whenever you are using this XML namespace, right, this XML schema namespace or this particular standard, you have to prefix the element with this XS prefix, right? So we call this a prefix, right? So as an example, let's say you are going to use some kind of element tag, you have to prefix it with, right? So here also you can see we have prefixed the schema, and here also we have prefixed the schema, right? So if we have SS here, we have to prefix it with SS, right? Likewise, here we say the elements belong to this particular namespace or this particular standard will be prefixed with this particular namespace or XS namespace, right? Understood? If you don't understand, you have to tell me.
So I can CDP XML NS XML schema එකේ තියෙන ඒක ටික load කරගන්න ඕනේ. ඊට පස්සේ ඒකනේ දැන් ඔය XXL සමාන කරලා තියෙන්නේ. එතකොට අර මේ XML schema එකේ තියෙන element එක use කරන්න නම් අපි අර අතන මේ namespace එකට හැපැත්තෙන් define කරන එක හරහා තමයි call කරන්නේ නේද?
ඔව් මේ prefix එක හරහා තමයි අපි ඒක use කරනවා කියලා XML pass කරන engine එකට කියන්නේ.
ඒ කියන්නේ එතකොට මේ මෙතන මේ XX එක හරහා එතකොට දැන් element කියලා එකක් තියෙනවා නේද? element කියලා එකක් තියෙනවද XML schema එක ඇතුලේ අර උඩ URL එක හරහා යන පිටුව ඇතුලේ?
ඔව් ඒක ඇතුලේ තියෙනවා. ඒක ඇතුලේ when you go to this standard you can see there is XML access element, right? See? So we are saying the browser that or whatever the engine that we are going to use or the application that we are going to use, that we are using this particular namespace for this element, right? May element that we use kara menne me particular namespace ekkenai here we are saying, right? So so it indicates that the element and data types used in this the schema comes from the w3.org XML schema namespace, right? It specifies that the element and data types that comes from the w3.org XML schema namespace should be prefixed with XS, right? So here it defines that whatever the information comes with this particular standard, right? May standard ekat ekkena mokak hara data type එක අපි use කරනවා නම් we have to prefix it with this XS. මේ XS කියන එකත් එක්ක අපි ඒක prefix කරන්න ඕනේ each time when we are using this particular scheme, right? So then again we have another attribute, right? So let's say mysite.com. So what is this target namespace, right? So it indicates that this elements defined by this schema, right? Not to from heading body, these things. May document that we define namespaces in a particular. So simply what we are saying is the namespaces we are getting from this schema is being used at this particular site, right? We are use simply can, right? So whatever the things that we are taking from this schema, we are going to use it at this scheme, right? This is what we are saying, right? So and then we have to define the default namespace for this document, right? So the default namespace for this document is, let's say, this one. So this is the default namespace. Now the namespace configuration is done, right? So now we can define the XML schema definitions on data type.
XML so I parako target namespace enumeration එකයි මේ XML එකයි දාපු එක චූට් එකයි පාර එක්ස්ටෙන්ඩ් කරන්න.
XML එකයි දාපු එකයි ආපහු කියන්නේ කියන්නේ.
ඔව් මේ දෙවෙනි rule එක තුන්වෙනි එකයි.
Right.
ඔය my site එක දැම්මේ.
Oh, right. Okay. So it's basically like this. Then මෙතනින් ගන්නවා namespaces ටිකක්. So we are taking some namespaces from XML schema, right? And then we have to have a target namespace now. මෙතනින් ගන්නේ අපි use කරන මොන namespace එකකටද කියලා කියන්නේ, right? So even though we take some namespaces for the schema from this XML schema, right? We are taking schema from this, or this is the framework, or this is the standard. XML schema in w3.org is the standard, right? So we are taking this schema, which is a standard, and we have to use it for our own schema. අපි මේක use කරන්නේ අපේ schema එකක් define කරන්නනේ. So we have to define what is the schema that we are going to define with this particular standard. මේ standard එක අරගෙන අපි define කරන්න namespace එක මොකක්ද කියලා we have to say, right? So we are defining this target namespace, which is mysite.com, right? This target namespace is the namespace definition that we are going to define using this particular standard. The standard they use කරලා අපි define කරන්නේ මෙන්න මේ namespace. and this is the default namespace again, right? So this is the default namespace that we are going to use it in this document, right? Right. So let's say how to refer this in our own XML document, right? Then we can namespace define kara, and then there should be a way to use this in our own document, right? As an example, let's say we are using our own XML document for node.txt, right? So we are using this one. Here we are defining this node.xml namespace, right? So same example that is here, right? So here what we are going to do is, now do you remember that last week when we are doing that, let me show that example again here. If you can remember last week when we are doing this, now we have defined the DTD here and we have utilized that DTD here, right? Then we DTD ke monad elements, monad attributes ke define kara, and we have used the same definition here, right? Then we define kara, here we are using. So in the similar way, we are doing it here also. But the difference is we can't define the usual XML document in this schema. Schema document define karan bad. So because of that, we have to have a separate document, and we have to say what is the namespace that we are going to use, default namespace, right? So in this case, for this XML document, we are going to use this mysite.com namespace. mysite.com can namespace negative use schema, right? Here we simply say that we are going to use mysite.com namespace for this XML schema, and then we have to define the location of this particular XML schema. Before that, we have to give the standard. So the standard is right. We use current XML schema කියන standard එක නෙමෙයි. Not XML schema, XS නෙමෙයි, XML schema නෙමෙයි. Here we are using XML schema instance, right? So once this example is done, I'll define you the difference between XML schema and XML schema instance, right? So and the XML schema location, we have to give the URL of this file. We file like URL, right? So the URL of that file is XML schema.xml, right? Or else you can save this as like XSD save right? Either ways are correct. Make up XSD save, but here we have saved XML. So we are using XML, right? Then we can define the not here like this. We can define the not, right? So the difference between XML schema and XML schema instance, right? So this is XML schema, and this is the XML schema instance, right? So what happens here is, when it comes to XML schema means the properties or the standards that we are going to use, right? Right. So this applies to when it comes to XML schema definitions. Api schema define karaddi monad use karana elements, monad use karana data types, monad use karana attribute types. Those things are defined in XML schema, right? But when it comes to XML instance, api XML schema use karla mogak hari application ek instance ek define karna. When we are defining an instance by using particular XML schema, right? So here we use this XML schema to define another XML schema to be used within our application. We can XML schema use karane mysite.com XML schema එක අපේ application එකට customize කරගන්න. or customizedly develop කරගන්න. But here we are using this particular XML schema definition that we did here. We are using it in this instance. So in this case, we have to get the schemas that are applicable for instances, or the standards that are applicable for instances. So we are getting here we are getting the XML schema. Here we are getting the XML schema instance, right? So once you define these two, මෙතන ඔයගොල්ලන්ට පැටලෙන එකම දේ තියෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේ attribute set එක. Sorry, these attributes මෙන්න මේ තමයි ඔයගොල්ලන්ට පැටලෙන එකම දේ මෙතන. ඊට පස්සේ this is the same thing as usual, right? ඊට පස්සේ මේක අරගෙන ඉන්න තමයි. Right. So as an example, if we go back to this example, right, to make it again. If we use this same example here, we have to define the root element. අපි අර DTD කරපු විදිහම තමයි. Right? So equals not, which is the root element of this document, right? And then inside that we have to define access the data type, right, which is complex type. And then we are defining the sequence of elements, right? So this is the, here we have, and the type is string. And then again we are going to have again the data type is string, right? And then again we are going to have again similar, right? So what we are going to do here is now we can use these elements in this document, right? So what I did here is I have defined the root element, which is not, right? It is not in this document. And here I have defined a complex type. So as I taught you earlier, there are two types of elements. What are them? Complex types and simple types, right? So complex types have what? Sub-elements. Simple types doesn't have any sub-element. It is the last element, right? So, and here we have this sequence. Sequence means this sequence is going to repeat, right? This sequence is going to repeat, right? And then we have the simple type elements, or the usual elements that we are going to use. Now these are simple types, right? So here we have, I have used this XS here, XS. Why do I have used them? That is because I am using this XML Schema Standard, and the documents in these standards have to be prefixed with this XS prefix, right? මම use කරන්නේ මේ XML schema කියන namespace එක. එතකොට XML schema කියන namespace එකකින් තියෙන namespace එක use කරන හැම element එකක්ම හැම data type එකක්ම මේ XS කියන prefix එක දාලා prefix කරන්න ඕනේ, right? එතකොට මෙතන XS වෙනුවට ASTL තිබ්බනම් මේ ඔක්කොම ASN, right? So that is flexible again, right? So I have defined the XSD now. XSD එක define කරලා තියෙනවා. DTD එකකින් XSD එක define කරලා තියෙනවා. අපි last week කතා කරේ DTD ගැන. So here similarly I have defined a XSD, right? So using this XSD I defined, now I'm going to create a node. Node create करना मैं use करना, right? So the namespace that is going to use in this XML document is mysite.com, right? Which is the same namespace of this one. So make a namespace like mysite.com. So I'm method use करने mysite.com के ना namespace. ये तो मैं method use करना. I'm using the standard from w3.org for XML instances, XML schema instances, right? So this is the standard for XML schema instances. I'm saying this. We are going to use XML schema instance standard for this document, right? And then the location for my original scheme, right? Mama define karo schema ke location, mysite.com ke location, which is XML schema.xml or XSD, right? So now I can use whatever the elements that I have defined here, right? To, from, heading, body, whatever the things that I have defined here, I can use them here, right? So what will happen if I use my prefix here? my කියන prefix එක මම use කරත් මොකද වෙන්නේ? මෙතන මොකක්ද දෙන්න ඕනේ වෙනස් කරන්න. මම මෙතන කියනවා මම use කරන්නේ mysite.com කියන namespace එක, which is this namespace. I'm going to use this mysite.com namespace, which we defined earlier, right? So here I define this prefix. My කියලා prefix එකක් දානවා ඉස්සරහට. So if I use my prefix here, what are the things that should be changed in this place? මෙන්න මේ tags වල මොනවද වෙනස් වෙන්නේ? Anyone? So here I have used this XS prefix for this standard schema. මේකට මම use කරා XS කියන prefix එක. එතකොට මට ඒකේ තියෙන හැම element එකක් ඉස්සරහටම XS කියන එක දාන්න ඕනේ, right? එතකොට මම මෙතනට use කරන්නේ mysite කියන prefix එක. Sorry, mysite කියන standard එක, which I defined. මම define කරපු standard. So in that case, and I have prefixed it with my, right? So if I use this my here, my use karo, what is the difference that I have to make in these tags? මේ tags වල මට මොකක්ද කරන්න දෙන්නේ වෙනස? Can anyone tell me? So simply
my
have to use my here. Right? Like this. So now I know that you don't understand because this is very complex. Now, do you have any questions? Make it තේරෙන්නේ නැද්ද මොනවද? ඔයගොල්ලෝ practicals දෙක තුනක් කරනකොට කොහොමදත් මේක තේරෙන්නේ නැහැ. So before going for practicals, what are the things that you don't understand here? You can ask before we are going to the elements section.
Hello sir.
Yes.
Hello. आपको කියලා දෙන්නකොට my note xml අර ටික දාපු හැටි link එක යන විදිහ.
my.xml එක දාපු හැටි.
ඔව් line 3 එක line 3. නැත්නම් අනිත් එකේ හරි කමක් නැහැ කියලා දෙන්න.
කොයි ටික දාට තේරුනේ නැත්තේ හරියටම මට කියන්න.
line 3.
line 3 this one here. මෙතන my එක දාපු හැටි.
නෑ ඒක අර දැන් කලින් කරපු example එකේ ඒ ටැබ් එකේ වෙනස්නේ මේක වෙනස් විදියක් නේ ඒ දෙක කොහොමද වෙනස් වෙන්නේ මේක
මේක වෙනස් වෙන්නේ මෙහෙමයි right. Let me open up the last week's. So this is the last week's example, right? So here you can see we define the entire thing, entire standard or entire DTD for the document in a single document, right? අපි මේක use කරලා තියෙන්නේ single document එකක් ඇතුළේ. but අපිට මෙන්න මේ කැලල අපිට වෙන document එකකට ගන්නත් පුළුවන්, right? As an example, we can take it to a separate document and link with this, right? එහෙම කරන්නත් පුළුවන්, right? Or else we can define it internally like this, right? So as an example, the best example I can show you is when it comes to CSS, there are two ways to define CSS now. You can define CSS inline, internal or external, right? In the same way, XML also, DTDs, we can define internally and externally. So here we have done the internal way inside our XML document, right? So first we have defined the standards and then we have defined the document, right? So when it comes to XML schema, because it is very complex, you can't do the same thing, right? You can't define XML schema definitions and XML document within the same documents because that is very complex, right? But you can achieve that also, but that is very complex, so we don't do that. So first of all, we are going to define the XML standard here, right? So this is the XML standard. So when we are defining the XML standard, we have to use certain types of things, elements, attributes, data types, and those things, right? එතකොට data types ගත්තාම integer data types තියෙනවා, boolean data types තියෙනවා, strings තියෙනවා. Well, there are many more data types, right? So these data types should be standardized data types. So if we are going to define these data types as well, that means we can't define compatible XML documents, right? එතකොට මම define කරන data type එකයි develop වෙන තව කෙනෙක් define කරන data type එකයි දෙකක්. So there should be some sort of standard for these data types, right? So w3.org, which is the standard maintaining organization for World Wide Web. අර ලංකාවේ ප්‍රමිති ආයතනය කියලා තියෙන පොඩ්ඩක් දැන් ප්‍රමිතිය බලන්න. අන්න ඒ වගේ w3.org is the institute that is maintain the standards of the web, right? So this w3.org has defined this XML schema, which is the standard for XML schema definitions. So this has these element types, these data types, and attribute types, many things it has, right? So using this schema, we can define our own XML documents or our own XML schemas. Again, w3.org කියන standard XML schema use කරලා අපිට පුළුවන් අපේම XML schema එකක් අපේ application එකට define කරගන්න, right? එතෙන්ට එනකල් තේරෙනවද? Understood up to that point?
Oh, sir.
Right. Okay. So here we say that we are going to use this XML namespace from w3.org. අපි මෙතනදී මේ XML NS කියන එකද අපි කියනවා w3.org එකේ මේක අපි standard එක අපි use කරනවා, right? So then here we have used this access tag. එතකොට මේක මෙන්න මේ විදිහට තිබ්බත් අපිට මේක use කරන්න පුළුවන්. Right? Even though it is being here like this, we can use this, right? But since we are using some other namespace from some other provider, right? අපි තව කෙනකින් data type එක use කරන නිසා to avoid confusion එක නවත්ත ගන්න අපි මෙතනට use කරනවා අපේ prefix එක, right? එතකොට මේ prefix එක දාපුවාම each time that we are using this XML schema, when we put this prefix here, each time when we are using this XML schema, we have to use this prefix also, right? අපි මේ prefix එක දාන්නේ to avoid confusions, right? Because අපි define කරනවා schema එකක් අපි use කරනවා මේගොල්ලන්ගේ schema එක. To avoid confusions, we are using this prefix. ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ ඔය අපේ පැටලෙන එක නවත්තන්න we are using this prefix. So when we use this prefix, each time when we are using an element or attribute or data type from this particular XML schema document, we have to use this prefix. එතකොට මම මේ ආගේ එකක් use කරනවා මම හැම වෙලෙම prefix එක use කරන්න ඕනේ, right? This avoids confusion between our data types or our elements and their elements. ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ elements උයි අපේ elements උයි අතරේ අපිට pattern එක මේක නිසා නතර වෙනවා. This will minimize the mix downs of schemas, right? Understood?
Yes, sir.
So here I have defined XML schema, which is this one. This access man use karna kiyanne, I'm telling the browser or the document which or the document controller which I'm handling this XML document that I'm going to use this standard, right? So access element from this standard and the element's name is node. So this is the root node, right? Or the root element of the document, right? But in this document, XML document root element make a definition, okay? But in our child documents, this is the root element, which is node, right? And when it comes to XML schema, there are two types of data types. First one is simple type, second one is complex type, right? So what is complex type? Complex type means it always has sub elements, right? Complex type can have parent can. It always has child elements or sub elements, right? So here we define a complex type because it is going to have some sub elements. So this complex type has a sequence of elements, right? It's a sequence, element sequence. So a sequence is 4 elements, right? So here we have used the data type XX string, right? So string means it is a simple type. So this is a complex type because it has child elements, right? So this doesn't have any child element and we are using a data type provided by this. Data type use access string. It is a simple type, right? Then maybe I will make a define, right? So now the schema definition is done or XSD is done, right? So this is similar to defining this part in DTD. DTD के मैंने में part एक define करने का समान है XSD के मैंने में part एक define कर. Understood? So this is the standard for our, this is the layout or this is the standard for our XML document. आप application use XML documents standard एक तमाही make. Understood?
Oh, sir.
Right. So now the standard is defined. Now we have to define the document type or the document, right? So here we are defining the document. And here we say the root element is not. So we can see the root element is not. And we have to say what is the standard that we are going to use, right? So here we are using this XML or mysite.com standard. Up use mysite.com standard. Here we have defined the default namespace for this standard, which is mysite.com. So here we are saying the document that for this not element or the not root element, mysite.com is the default standard that we are going to use. And here we have called another data type from w3.org, right? Which is XML schema instance, right? So this is here it is XML schema. Here this is XML schema instance, right? So there's a difference. XML schema is the standard and we are using it to define the XML standard. But XML schema instance is used whenever we are consuming particular schema and making our own documents. आपके documents वगैरह आप use करने instance है क्या? आप schema का define करने use करने schema. Here we are using XML schema instance, and then we have to give the XML schema location, right? So the location of our schema, which is XML schema.xml. When we make a location, right? So that is XML schema.xml. इतना एक वेब डेटा होस्ट कर ला दिया ना आप इट गया प्रोग्राम http mysite.com xml schema.xml කියන මම මේ ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එක යූස් කරනවා, right? ඊට පස්සේ අපිට පුළුවන් මේ තියෙන child elements ටික යූස් කරලා අපේ document එක define කරන්න, like we did in DTD example. We DTD එක කරා වගේම අපිට පුළුවන් මේ විදිහට මේක define කරගන්න. Right? So the question I asked was, if I put my here, what is the change that I have to do in this? මේකද මට මොකක්ද කරන්න change. මෙතෙන්ට අපි my කියන prefix එක use කරමු. මේ ටිකේට මොකක්ද කරන්න ඕනේ? next.
වෙනකොට දානවා my colon 2.
my කියන prefix එක මේ විදිහට use කරන්න. Right? So usually we don't have to do that, because if we are doing this only if we have a lots of complex data types defined in our document. Right? Since we don't have, this is the simple thing. Right? Understood everyone? ඔක්කොම තේරුණාද? තේරෙන්න තියෙනවා කියන්නේ I can explain again if you want. Everyone understood?
So දැන් ඔය අදගේ ෆයිල් දෙකම තියෙන්නේ මේ අපි host කරන site එකේද එහෙම නැත්නම් ඔය mysite.com කියන්නේ අපි host කරන site එකේ දෙන මේ ඒ කියන්නේ
mysite.com කියන්නේ අපි host කරනවා.
එතකොට ඒකේ තමයි මේ දැන් ඔය පේන මේ XML ෆයිල් එක තියෙන්නේ ඒකේ නේද?
ඒකේ. ඔව්. ඒක අපි define කරන XML ෆයිල් එක තියෙන අපේ site එකේ standards that we are using, that is hosted on w3.org.
එතකොට දැන් අර ඕකට කලින් එක ඇවිල්ලා ඒ W3 එකේ host කරලා තියෙන විදිහකද? දැන් නැත්තම්
ඔව් W3 host කරලා තියෙන්නේ මේක. this one.
හරි. එතකොට දැන් ඕකෙත් තියෙන්නේ මේ XML ෆයිල් එකනේ.
ඔව්.
එතකොට ඒ XML ෆයිල් එක තියෙන්නේ කොතනද?
මේකත් අපි host කරනවා අපේ එකේ. මොකද අපි මේ දෙවෙනි ෆයිල් එකේදී refer කරන්නේ අපේ පළවෙනි ෆයිල් එකනේ.
හරි. ඒ කියන්නේ ඔය දෙකම තියෙන්නේ අපේ site එකේ.
අපේ එකේ තියෙනවා. ඔව්.
හරි සර්.
Right? Right. So if you have any questions, you can ask now before moving into the next one.
So දැන් එතකොට දැන් දෙවෙනි ෆයිල් එකට පළවෙනි ෆයිල් එක කෝල් කරන පළවෙනි ෆයිල් එක දෙනවා පළවෙනි ෆයිල් එකෙන් දෙවෙනි ෆයිල් එකට කෝල් කරලා මේ එතකොට එතන to from heading body වලට data මේ ඇදලා ගන්න එකද කරන්නේ
නෑ මේක පළවෙනි ෆයිල් එක දෙවෙනි ෆයිල් එකට කොයි වෙලාවත් කෝල් කරන්නේ නැහැ. පළවෙනි ෆයිල් එකේ තමයි තියෙන්නේ ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එක. එහෙම නැත්නම් ලේඅවුට් එක. අපි යූස් කරන ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එක මොකද, අපි යූස් කරන ලේඅවුට් එක මොකද, අපි යූස් කරන ප්‍රොපර්ටිස් මොනවද? ඒ ඔක්කොම තියෙන්නේ පළවෙනි එකේ. දෙවෙනි එකේ තමයි තියෙන්නේ the data that we are using. Right? So remember the last week's example that we did, DTD කිද අපි කියනවානේ මේ එලිමන්ට් එකේ තියෙනවානේ මේ මේකේ තියෙනවානේ මේක මේ විදියට. මේකේ මෙන්න මේ එලිමන්ට් විතරයි තියෙන්නේ. අන්නේ ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එක ඩිෆයින් කරන එකට එකම තමයි XSD කියන්නේ, right? So DTD has much more disadvantages, like we can't define the data type, we can't define any conditions, we can't do anything with DTD. DTD කියන්නේ very simple standard definition, right? අපි DTD එකේදීම ලොකු දේවල් මොකුත් කරන්න බැරි නිසායි we have XSD, right? So the same thing that we are doing with DTD and XSD, right? අපි standard එක define කරන එක තමයි මේකෙන් කරන්නේ. first file එක කරන්නේ standard එක define කරන්නේ. මේ standard එක define කරන්නේ. second file එකෙන් කරන්නේ standard එක validate කරගෙන ඒකට අනුව අපේ data ඔක්කොම වැඩ කරනවා. Right? Right. Any more questions? Any more questions from you? No. Right. So as an example, let's say අපි මේක වෙනස් කරමු පොඩ්ඩක් ඊට වඩා වෙනස් දෙයකට ස්ටුඩන්ට් කියලා. So tell me some attributes to be used in student කෙනෙක් ගත්තාම අපිට මොනවද use කරන්න තියෙන attributes?
Name.
first name. Type එක මොකක්ද?
String.
And then we have
Age එක.
data type එක.
Integer.
What the integer data type? What is a suitable data type?
Int. Number.
Int. But if there is any decimal value, so let's assume there is no definite decimal value.
Yes.
What is next? What are the other things?
Height.
Hmm?
Height එක. උස.
තේරුණේ?
උස.
Height. Let's say decimal. And then
Address.
address එක දැන් අමතක කරමු අපි දැන් address string එකක් ගත්තනේ. So let's take birthday, date of birth. Right, and then date of birth is 8. And then we have again can have something like
sex.
අපි A level එකේ දැන් use කරමු. Right. So these are the data types that we can use in this particular XML scheme. This scheme again data types තමයි මේ තියෙන්නේ. What are they? String, integer, decimal, date, and boolean. Right. So we can define it like this. Right. So when we go here, student. The root element is student. Then first tab we have name. So let's take the name. Right, and then we have, what did we have there? Age. Let's say like this. So we have height. This one again. So sir.
Digamos 150 centimeter.
Yes, yes.
150.
See, one side. Right.
So why is it 23? 26.
Why is it easy?
Why is it?
Why is it easy? Another one, right. And then we have the date of birth. Right. Make it over down. See again, I'm going to they got can over party of Karnataka.
12.
So then we have A level, which is a boolean that is at least either true or false. So here let's say true. Right. So what will happen if this document, now we have defined some sort of data types here. So what will happen if these data types are not compatible? The data types we used in this document are not compatible with the data types that we define here in definition. The definition again data types එක මෙයාලා compatible නැත්තම් මොකද වෙන්නේ? There will be an error. ගිය සතියේ pass වෙන්න තියෙන එකක් ආවේ. So like that there will be an error, right? So this is the main advantage of using XML schema definitions than DTD. DTD use karana we can never have this sort of validation with XML documents. The only data type that is available is PC data, right? So make it here the only data type we have is PC data, right? So that can either be a number, boolean, integer, string, whatever, date, time, whatever, right? So only the data type what we have is PC data. So we can't have any validation within the XML document level. So the advantage of using this XSD is we have this validation capabilities, right? So this is the data types and these are the values. If we don't adhere to these standards defined in this document, standards adhere, there will be a passing error for XML. Understood everyone?
Yes.
Any questions? You will be getting a question in your exam. I have the past papers. Parana papers wala tibba me question. XSD ka define karana. So if you have any questions, anything you don't understand, you can ask me now. Miking hand lajjana, you can type.
Hello sir.
Yes. Hello.
Sir, schema එකට පොඩ්ඩක් ගන්නවා.
Right.
සර් දැන් අපි student element එක හදුවානේ.
ඔව්.
ඔතන වෙනත් element එකක් හදනවා නම් ඒක අර document එකේ තව element එකක් විතර දානවා නැත්නම් වෙනත් document එකක් හදලා දාන්න පුළුවන්ද?
ඒකට දාන්න පුළුවන්. දැන් මෙතන අපිට පුළුවන් තව element එකක් මේ විදිහටම define කරන්න මේ teacher කියලා or lecturer කියලා. Right? So එතකොට අපිට මේක ඇතුලේ use කරන්න බෑ because the root element of this is student. මේකේ root element එක student. මේකට වෙන root element එකක් අපිට use කරන්න බෑ. But we can use another XML document and we can have the root element as lecturer and use the same data type in that document.
එනවා sir.
Any more questions? Good question.
එතකොට sir මේ ඒකම ඒ document එකම දානවා නම් මේ තව complex type එකක් හදා ගන්න ඕනේ. Oh, complex element එක තව එකක් හදා ගන්න ඕනේ. Complex element එක හදා ගන්න. So you can have multiple schema definitions in one document, but you can't have the same root element in many documents. Many documents which are using this standard. The schema එක define කරන කරලා අපිට මේ වගේ multiple schema define කරන්න පුළුවන්. But in a document you can't have multiple root elements, right? තා මේක තව string කීයක් දැම්මම මේක pass වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Right? Understood? Okay sir. ඔව් sir තේරුණා.
Any more questions? දැන් අර මුලින් තිබ්බ පැටලෙන එක තියෙන්නේ නැහැ නේද?
ඔව්
නෑ sir.
ටික කියනවා.
Right. Any more questions? Or can we move further?
So data parser එක පොඩ්ඩක් බලමු.
ඒකද?
data parser එක පොඩ්ඩක් බලමු real විදිහට.
Validation එකක්ද?
ඔව්.
මේක validation එකක් කරන්න අපි කලින් කරා. මොකද එකම document එකේ මේක මේව කරන්න බෑ. ඒ නිසා මේක අපි document එක දැන් දෙකක් host කරලා අපි මේක validate කරනවා. ඒක මම දැන්ට අද මගේ hosting එකට මට access කරන්න විදියක් නෑ AWS එකේ. මම ඒක next week වෙනනවා කරන example එක.
හරි සර්.
I'm using office laptop today. I don't have domain access here. Yeah, working from home now.
දෙකම දාන්න ඕනේ. දෙකම අපි host කරන්න ඕනේ.
දෙකම අපි host කරන්න ඕනේ. මේ files දෙක අපි දෙකක host කරලා ඊට පස්සේ validate එකට links දෙක දෙන්න ඕනේ.
host දෙකකද තනි host එකකද?
නෑ තනි host එක host කරන්න පුළුවන් ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑ. කොහොමරි අපිට මේකට URL එකක් දෙන්න පුළුවන්. That's it. Wsdl schools එකේ validate එකක් තියෙනවා. තව online validators කීපෙකුත් තියෙනවා. file එකක් upload කරන්න කරලා validate කරන්න පුළුවන්. But I'm not too sure about the output of those things. සමහර ඒවා validate වෙන්නේ නැහැ. So we have some more parts to complete today in these elements and defaults and some validations and things. So once those are completed, we'll move to the what you call the validation part next week with some more practical. Over practical start karna. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Right. Any more questions? Anything you don't understand? The namespace part is the unclear part. Other things are okay. Right. Let me think about a way to explain namespaces. Right. There's one message in the chat. The namespace part is the only part that you don't understand. Let me think about a way to explain namespaces. In the meantime, do you want to take a break till I find a way to explain this namespaces more simple way?
Okay, sir.
Right, just take 10 minutes. Be like in 7:15. We'll start with namespaces. So all three are defining three namespaces, right? So I'm developing the student part. So I'm having a separate namespace for me, right? My students part. The person who is developing lecturer's part, he is going to have a separate namespace for his thing. So separate schema for his things. So likewise, there can be many. So in order to avoid confusions, we just use this namespace to make sure that there is no confusions in between these elements, right? So here, this target namespace means, and XML namespace means that we are going to use these two namespaces for the things that is going to define here. Define කරන දේවල් මේ දේවල් ටික ඔක්කොම belong to this namespace. මෙන්න මේ namespace එකට ඒ ටික belong වෙනවා කියන්නේ we use this target namespace. So whenever we call it from this side, right? So whenever we call this mysite.com namespace from this side, so the XML document knows what are the elements that are related to this particular element, right? Of a particular document. Document එකට අදාළ වෙන namespaces මොනවද කියලා මේ document එක දන්නවා, right? That is the only reason that we are using namespaces. Even though you don't use namespaces, this might work in the way that you program, right? So the only reason for defining these namespaces are to have the reference between this document and the XSD, right? So here we say all this side belongs to this target namespace, which is mysite.com. And here we say we are using namespaces or the elements from mysite.com namespace. Right? Understood? That's it. Nothing fancy, nothing rocket science. Okay. Right. So you will get more clarity when we do some practicals. So when we do some practicals, you will understand why we use this and why we use that. So we'll do some practicals next week, like we did in last week. But this online is not the ideal approach. I don't know whether you do it or not. So let's see. But still, this is the only option that we have for the moment. So we did XSD elements. Elements we did now. These are the data types we have: string, integer, decimal, date, boolean, and apart from that we have time also. Within a time key that window here, right? So let's say you want to have some default values.
Right? What is the default value? Even though you mention a value or not, XML will assume the default value of this particular element is this one, right? We value එක assign කරත් නැත්නම් මේකේ default value එක මෙන්න මේක කියලා XML assume කරනවා when we assign the default value. As an example, if we want to set the default value of a level is equal to true, right? We can define default is true, right? So whether you give this value as true or false or whatever, may value like a blank thing, but this XML will assume that the default value for this element is true, right? So you can set the default attribute like this for each and every element. Understood? Apart from this type and name attributes, you have the default attribute. So you can set the default values there. Okay, right. Questions from anything that we did up to now? Before moving to attributes, the next part is attributes. Before moving to attributes, do you have any questions? So I assume that. So moving into attributes, right? So in DTD, we define attributes. How did we define the attributes? Like this, ATT list. When we were doing that DTD, the definition of attributes are like this: ATT list, the element, and the attribute name, the data type, whether it is required or not. Right? Right. So in the same way, we can use attributes in the XSD also. Right? So if we are defining an attribute here, it will be like this XS attribute. So XS means this one. So the name of the attribute, let's say, right? So this is an attribute definition in what you call XSD. XSD or attribute එක අපි define කරන්නේ මෙන්න මේ විදිහට. Right? So when you define an attribute like this here, we can again set default values for these attributes. Attributes are the default values set. Right? So default value is y. So like that, you can set default values. Right? So or else we can set a fixed value. Right? So let's do it like this for the first time. Language. Right. So I define this attribute. The attribute's name is lang. Lang stands for language. So if we go here, if you want to set the student's language, you can set it like this. Language. That is Sinhalese. Right? Like this. So I define the language attribute here. The data type is a string, and I set the attribute here at student with the value. Right? So if you want to set a default value for this attribute, you can use default tag, which is, let's see, for English. So this is the default, right? So apart from that, we can have this required as well. What will happen when we use required? Required use karam this attributes, and this attribute will become a required value. You definitely have to set the attribute whenever you are using this particular attribute.
මේ language එක attribute use කරන අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම value එකක් set කරන්න ඕනේ. empty තිබ්බොත් it will show an error. Right? So this is attributes. So you can define attributes like this. Right. So do you understand?
Yes, sir.
So the next thing is restrictions on values. Right. So what is this restriction on values? Right. So let's say you want your users to select a few values out of the values. Let's say gender. Gender is either male or female. Right. So gender is either male or female. Whenever you give the inputs to user, you just want to see whether user inputs either one of them, either male or female. A values together, I go on to gender attribute, right? So we can restrict those values, right? We can place restrictions on values. So that is called restrictions on values. So as an example, let's say if we have a value here, element's name is gender, type is either, type is string. In that case, in this case, if we define it here, define the gender, right? So this should be either male or female. Gender should be either male or female, right? So whenever we are giving this gender value, the gender value එක දෙනකොට right, we need to have some sort of restriction. So the values that this XML document should accept is either male or female, nothing other than that. So we have to have some sort of restriction here, right? So in this case, we need to define a, right? So we are defining a simple type here. Here we are defining the restriction, right? This is I'm going to explain what is this after typing this. So this is it. So here we have defined the element gender, and this gender is simple type because it used this base value XS string, right? So the data type is string, right? And then we place a restriction. So two enumeration constraints. Now this enumeration is something comes with this XML schema. Value is male and the second value is female, right? So whenever you are using this one, you have to have either values of this male or female. Male or female here they can right? So you can use this enumeration constraint comes with this XML schema. XML schema is an enumeration constraint. Enumeration කියන මෙන්න මේ constraint එක. ඒ constraint එක කියන්නේ මේ වගේ multiple values වලින් එකක් අපිට select කරගන්න දෙනවා. Right? In that case, you can have it like this. Right? Then on.
Okay, sir.
Right. So මේ වගේ constraints කීපයක්ම තියෙනවා, right? So one is මෙතන අපි enumeration වෙනකොට pattern එකක් use කරනවා. Regular expressions අහලා තියෙනවා. regex කියන්නේ JavaScript එහෙම කරනකොට
right ඒ වගේ අපිට pattern එකක් දෙන්න. මේ pattern එක කියන්නේ අපි මෙතනට දුන්නත් එහෙම මේක pattern කියලා. මේක අපිට දෙන්න පුළුවන්. A to Z කියලා. කියන්නේ A to Z කියන capital letters විතරයි මෙතනට accept කරන්නේ. right මෙතනට අපිට ඕන දෙන්න පුළුවන් A to Z කියලා. simple letters උත් accept කරනවා. මෙතනට අපිට දෙන්න පුළුවන් 0 to 9. එතකොට digits උත් accept කරනවා. right ඒ pattern කියන්නේ ඒ වගේ. ඒ වගේ constraints කීපයක්ම තියෙනවා මේක ඇතුලේ. one is enumeration, then we have patterns, right, then we have again min inclusive and max inclusive. ඒ කියන්නේ minimum තියෙන්න පුළුවන් minimum value එකයි maximum value එකයි. right likewise there are different things that we can use for these restrictions. So we are using these restrictions in order to see that we are getting the value. So we are performing some sort of validation before using data with this XML document. Right?
Right, sir.
Right. Apart from that, we can have length, max length, minimum length. Here again, Kodak restriction types we have, right? So as an example, we can have these things. I'll type it out here. Inclusive, max inclusive, pattern, and length, minimum length, maximum length. So there are enumerations type, this restriction types that we can use for this sort of elements that we want to restrict values. Right? Okay. Any questions from these things? Anything? Right. I think there were some unclear parts in these XML related things in our first sessions, like Wsdl and SOAP. So let's go back to these things and see whether you will get these things now. I think this one, you had some confusions in this section. Right? So I told you that once I complete this XML, you will have a better understand about XML and these things. So we can do this again. Right? So yeah. Right. So Wsdl web services description language. Right. I'm asking questions, so you can answer if you know. So Wsdl stands for Web Services Description Language. Is the standard format for describing web service, right? So basically Wsdl is XML-based protocol, a protocol for information exchange in decentralized and distributed environments, right? And Wsdl defines how to describe or access a web service, what operations will it perform, right? So right. So these things, the basics, I think you remember. I saw a good tutorial today. Right. So basically, when it comes to web services development, there are two key things. So 2 or 3 key things that we need to give our attention. Right. So I'll send you the link for this tutorial also. So there are few key things that we have to give our attention when it comes to web services and SOAP and web services development. Right. So the first one is Wsdl, which is this one. and then we have SOAP, and then we have web services. And apart from that, we have UDDI also. Right? So the basic function of Wsdl is Wsdl tells us about the functions that you can implement or expose to the client. Right? So as an example, let's say you have a web service for a calculator. Right? So you are writing a website. It is a web service and for a calculator. So this is just an example. So what happens here is when the client wants to do some calculations, he simply can send a request to your site saying that add these two numbers, subtract these two numbers, multiply these numbers likewise. So you get the request from the client and you give the response to the client. So that's what web services do. So Wsdl tells what are the functions that you can implement to the client or you can give to the client using this particular web service. Right? So Wsdl give the definition. What can be given? What are the requests that can be or responses that can be given to clients using this particular web service, right? So if we get the calculate example, that can be add, delete, subtract, multiply, and so on, right? So when it comes to SOAP, right? So Wsdl is that thing. Apart from Wsdl, we learned something called SOAP. So what is the SOAP? SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, right? So in order to do the functions that defined in Wsdl, as an example, if we take the calculate example, the functions were subtract, addition, multiply, division, those things, right? So to perform the functions, those are defined in the web services language, we are sending the request through this SOAP protocol or Simple Object Access Protocol, right? So when we are sending the request, according to the Wsdl, when we are sending that request to SOAP, right? So SOAP will deliver the message to the web service will give us the response. And how these responses, how this SOAP, how this message structure, architecture, everything defined there is defined inside this Wsdl or Web Services Definition language. Right? So if you go to a real world example, example like that, we can, for an example, we can see Wsdl as a menu in a restaurant. Right? When you go to a restaurant, you are given the menu. Restaurant area, you get a menu. Many items you purchase. Many items you purchase. Many items you purchase. Chicken, barbecue, right? So this is the menu, and this is the amount that you have to pay for that, right? This is how you should order these things. So every instruction is given to us with the menu, right? Menu order. Wsdl is something like that. It is the menu for web service, right? And then we are making the request, right? Right? So that means we are making a request to the waiter. So waiter will go there and bring us the food that we order, right? So this waiter is more like SOAP. So Wsdl is like, so that is the real world example that we can get for what you call Wsdl and SOAP. So in here, Wsdl defines how a web service can be accessed, what are the data types and what are the operations it will perform, right? And how it works, the entire thing. Moving forward, right? So Wsdl often used in combination with Xml Schema to provide websites oriented. So Xml Schema we learned now, right? So this is the standard Wsdl 1.1. It is again generalized by W3C, right? Which is the standard organization for web technologies. Right. Wsdl breakdowns web services into 3 specific identifiable elements that can be combined or used once defined, right? types, operations, and bindings. So these are the things that we are going to learn throughout this Wsdl. Right? So here are the elements. Definitions is the root element of Wsdl documents. Defines the names of the web service, declares multiple namespaces used throughout the remainder of the document, and it contains all the service elements described here, right? And it has data types. What are the data types that we are going to use? The message, right? So we get a message and we send a response to the message as another message. So the main communication protocol is the method is messages and operations, right? So what are the operations that is being used in this Wsdl, right? And the port type, the communication medium. So this can be request only, this can be a request response, and this can be response only. There can be several types of communication methods here. And then binding, right? So we can bind this to a request or response. Right. So moving forward, here you can see definitions, types, messages, port types, bindings, these things. Right. So this is the definition here, right? So this is a definition. You have the namespaces that is being used. So as we learned now, these are the standards that we are going to use throughout this Wsdl. Wsdl के आप use करना standards तमाम है, right? Hello service Wsdl, and then XML schema, the things that we know, right? So these are the name services that we are going to use throughout this Wsdl document. Again, මෙන්න මේවා තමයි මෙන්න මේ schemas වලට අදාළ elements තමයි we are going to use throughout this document, right? Yes. So we need to do some practicals in Wsdl. So from next week onwards, we try to do these practicals. Next week onwards, we are doing some practicals. In the meantime, do you have any questions from the things that we did till now? Anything that you don't understand? Anything you don't understand? If you have any questions, you can ask. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you some sort of take-home assignment today. Right, let me share you the screen. Right, so this is your first assessment. First means now, this is a combination of 3 assessments. Right, assignment but this is a combination of 3 assessments. Altogether, you have to have 6 or 7 assignments. So this is the first 3. Let's take this as the first 3 assessments. So you have to do these things. Any questions? Right. So first you have to compare and contrast between web application architectures. Our very first session. 1-tier architecture, 2-tier architecture, 3-tier, and n-tier architecture. Right. You have to see what the approaches of development and the database structures, application structures, MVC architecture. Those things you have to define here. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of each. Yes, you have to submit a PDF. Yes, you have to submit a PDF, right? And then you have to describe the advantages of service-oriented architecture by giving real-world examples, right? Not imaginary ones. You have to research through internet. You can read medium.com, and there are several good platforms, Stack Overflow, right? So you have to research through internet for some real-world examples where they use service-oriented architecture. There are many. Right? So you have to describe the advantages of service-oriented architecture with real-world examples. Right? And then assume that you are developing an application for fintech solution. What is fintech? Fintech means financial technology. Or a freebie, ඊට පස්සේ Combank Flash, ඊට පස්සේ මොනවද තව තියෙන applications. VOC එකේ මොකක්ද එකක් තියෙනවද? People Smart Wave App මොකක්ද තියෙනවද ඔය set එක? So assume that you're developing an application for a fintech solution, some solution like that. How can you use service-oriented architecture to automate the process? The fintech solution is given functions for basically. You are doing fund transfers, you are obtaining loans, you are paying your bills, you are making reloads, right? Many things you can do, right? Fintech can simply online banking solution, free yearly solution, like that, right? So assume that you're developing an application for a fintech solution. You're developing an application for a fintech solution. So how this service-oriented architecture is helpful for you to automate these processes, to do the application with minimum human interaction. Human interaction is level, right? And what is microservices architecture, right? Here, this part you have to do a bit of a research, and you can ask me also, and you have to do a bit of a research, right? And how it is being adopted at large scale tech companies. Large scale tech companies may comment adapt correct. So in this write-up, you can take that loosely coupled and tightly coupled things, advantages and disadvantages. You can include everything, and you can make a good report, and it should have 2,000 to 2,500 words maximum 2,500. So somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 would be enough. Any questions? You can have a month. Any questions? When is the deadline? You can have a month. You can have a month.
question report.
So this is basically 3 assessments in one. 3-in-1 package.
Oh yeah.
There will be one more. Make a 3-in-1 packages. Assessments 3-in-1 packages. Second one is a practical one. Make it try theory. Second one is practical. You have to develop websites. You have to write XML. You have to write MySQL databases. That's the practical. This is the only theory one. Any more questions regarding the assessment or anything? I'm not a buyer than any. You would correct it. Corona se adem dia me akal assignments dena ni. Submit karanna oni kawat. You can have a month. I'm not deadline එක tightly මේකයි කියලා මම කියන්නේ. Roughly you can have a month. I don't mind whether you take 1 month and a week also, right? But try to submit it within a month, right? So අපි අද වෙනකොට sessions 6ක් කරලා තියෙනවා. මම හිතන්නේ sessions ඔක්කොම තියෙන්නේ 14ක් හරි 15ක් හරි. So since you have 2 assessments, it's better for you if you complete this within a month. නැත්නම් අනිත් එකත් එක කොට ගෙවුනම දෙකම කරගන්න ඉන්නේ නිදි මරාගෙන කන්නේ බොන්නේ නැතුව. එහෙම තමයි කරන්නේ. Right? Any more questions regarding the assessment? No.
I think also.
Right. Good. So any questions from the things that we did today, or anything related to this software development or IT or anything? You have any questions before concluding the session?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
සර් මේ ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑමර්ස්ලා මේ කන්ස්ටන්ට් වැලියු ඩික්ලෙයාර් කරද්දී
ඔව්
ඒවට මේ දෙනවනේ සර් 0x එක එහෙම කික දෙනවනේ නේම් දෙනවනේ ඒවස ඇයි 1 2 4 8 ඒ වගේ යන්නේ
දෙනකොටද
ඔව් සර්
කියන්නේ ඒකට මෙහෙම ස්පෙસિෆික් හේතුවක් මෙන්න මේකයි කියලා නෑ but you know there are some best practices no කියන්නේ අර එක දිගට මේන්ටේන් වෙලා ට්‍රැඩිෂන්ස් වගේ දේවල් තියෙනවානේ ඒක තමයි ගොඩක්ම බේසිකලි එහෙම නැතුව අර මේ හේතුව නිසා අපි එහෙම කරනවා කියලා එක නෑ sometimes when it comes to test automation and things sometimes using those patterns is might be easier.
yes sir thank you
මේකේ networking එකක් තියෙනව නේද?
ඔව් සර් ඉන්ඩෙක්ස් එකේ මුලට net කියලා එන නිසා ඔක්කොම network කට්ටිය.
net කියලා network එකක් තියෙන්නේ right. So networking people, are you aware of new technologies, cloud architecture, those things?
Yes sir.
Of, in coming years about තුනක් හතරක් යනකොට ඔක්කොම cloud වලට migrate වෙනවා so you better be ready when ඉස්සර වගේ data centers කවුරුත් maintain කරන්නේ even in our office we had a good data center we have like 8 blade servers අපේ blade servers 8ක් විතරම තියෙනවා it separates more than 5 to 6 storage controllers RAID VR setup, VR site in another location. We had a huge data center infrastructure, but we are now considering to move to the cloud. We have to be up to date with the cloud infrastructure as well, mainly AWS.
AWS සාමාන්‍ය යන්නේ ඒක.
AWS certification එකක් එහෙම තියෙනවා. ඔයගොල්ලෝ වෙනස්ලා ගෙදර ඉන්නවා නම් කරන්න මේ register වෙන්න. Certification කියන්නේ AWS Cloud Solutions Architecture Associate.
සර් මේ මම කරනවා අර Coursera එකේ offer එකක් Coursera site එක offer එකක් අම්බලා ඒකේ හම්බුණා AWS ලගේ මේ course එකක්. ඒ කියන්නේ course 4ක් කරනවා fundamental එකයි තව මට කියන්නේ හරියට essential එකකුයි එහෙම අතර. ඒවා එතකොට එහෙම හදාගත්තට කමක් නැද්ද මොකද?
අන්නකමනේ කොහොමරි AWS skills හදන්න AWS වල as an example අපි මුලින්ම move කරන්නේ අපේ web application firewall. අපේ web application firewall එක in-house තිබ්බේ. Fortinet 40 web එක. අපි ඒක දැන් දාන්නේ cloud එකට. cloud එකෙන් තමයි එතකොට අපේ traffic එක අපිට එනවද cloud එකට යනවද? එහෙම තියෙන්නේ.
කොහොමත් on premises එක සාමාන්‍යයෙන් කියනවනේ backup එකක් දෙන්න හරි නේද? වන්දනද?
on premises අපි on premises එක අයින් කරන්න යනවා. web application firewall. අපේ firewall එකක් තියෙනවා perimeter firewall එකක් තියෙනවා. perimeter firewall එකට අමතරව we are going to have this web application firewall on the cloud. ඒක web services වලට විතරයි. web servers වලට විතරයි. කියන්නේ අපේ web එකට එනවා නම් හරි mobile app එකට එනවා නම් හරි ඒකට access කරන්න විතරයි ඒකම use කරන්නේ. ඒතකොට බැරි වෙලා හරි අපේ web එකේ users ලා ගන්න වැඩි නම් කීයට කරන්න බැරි නම් overflow එකක් තියෙන AWS එකේ. ඒකට root වෙනවා customer. So if you are doing networks, keep that in mind. You have to do those things. Networking විතරක්ම කරන්නත් එපා. System administration, networking දෙපැත්තම හදාගන්න. So you will have a good value in the industry. එකක් කියන්නේ networking පැත්ත විතරක් දැනගත්තා කියලාත් මදි. System administration පැත්ත විතරක් දැනගත්තා කියලාත් මදි. You need to have a good value if you know both things like server maintenance, server management, CSC වගේ. Red Hat certified වගේ එකකුයි එක cloud හරි networking පැත්තේ තියෙනවා නම් qualification එකක් the value is very high, the demand is very high. Right, did everyone send me the index numbers to the chat?
cloud එකට යන්න කලින් on premises එක පොඩ්ඩක් ඉන්ටර්නෙට් එකේ ගන්න වෙන්නේ නේද?
අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම ගන්න වෙනවා. නැත්නම් ඉතින් ජොබ් එකට ගියාම පොඩ්ඩක් ඉතින් මේ ඉන්ටර්න්ෂිප් එකක් කරලා ජොබ් එකට යනවා කියන්නේ ඔයගොල්ලෝ ගොඩක් කම්ෆර්ටබල් ජොබ් එකට ගියාට පස්සේ. කියන්නේ ඔයගොල්ලන්ට එක්ස්පෝෂර් එකක් තියෙනවනේ.
එකපාරට cloud වලට බැස්ස කියලාත් එහෙම ලොකුම එකක් නැහැ. ඒ මේ
ඔව්.
ප්‍රැක්ටිකලි වශයෙන් යනකොට
කොහොමද cloud කරත් on-premise කරත් මොනවා කරත් ඔයගොල්ලන්ට ජොබ් එකට යන්න කලින් ඉන්ටර්න්ෂිප් එකට යන්න පුළුවන් ඒක සෑහෙන කරනවා. software අයටයි networking අයටයි ඔක්කොටම. It's much more valuable for you.
අපිට පළවෙනි මාස 3ක ඉන්ටර්න්ෂිප් එකක් තිබ්බා මේ කොරෝනා ගේ ප්‍රශ්නේ ඉඳලා ඉන්ටර්න්ෂිප් එක නැති වුණානේ.
right.
කාටවත්
ඉතින් මේක කොරෝනා ඉවරනකල් ලේසි එකට හපවු මේ ඉන්ටර්න්ස්ලා recruit කරන්නෙත් මේ කම්පැනිස් වල රිස්ක් එකක් නේ. මේක ඉවරෙන්න ඕන ඔක්කොම ඉතින් හරියට බලමු ඉතින් දැන් වැක්සින් එක ඊට පස්සේ
දැන් මේ ගොඩක් අය මේ හයිබ්‍රිඩ් ක්ලවුඩ් පැත්තට යනවා නේ. මොකද යාළුවෝ සිකියුරිටි පැත්ත බලලා මේ ඩයලොග් වල ඈ hello sir එනවද?
එහෙනම් දැන් කියන්නේ
සර් මේ දැන් ගොඩක් කම්පැනිස් මේ හයිබ්‍රිඩ් ක්ලවුඩ් පැත්තට යනවා නේද? මේ සිකියුරිටි සම්පූර්ණ මේ ක්ලවුඩ් එකේම දාන්නේ නැතුව
on-premises එක අමතක කරලා මේ cloud එකට යන එකේ තේරුමක් නැහැ. හොඳම approach එක තමයි hybrid එක. කියන්නේ අපිට on-premises තියෙන resources use කරන්න පුළුවන්, cloud එක use කරන්න පුළුවන්. දැන් අපිට අත්‍තරම තියෙන මේ වගේ approach එකක්. අපේ දැන් සමහර components වල overflow එකක් තමයි cloud එකේ තියෙන්නේ. කියන්නේ හදිසියෙ හරි on-premises resources මත වෙනවනම් ටක් ගාලා overflow එකක් හදනවා AWS එකේ. කියන්නේ EC2 instances වල තියෙන auto scaling group එකක ටක් ගාලා මේ EC2 එකෙන් තව instances ඇදලා අපේ load එක balance කරගන්න. ගොඩක් දුරට ඉතින් hybrid cloud යන එක තමයි ලාභ වැඩි. ඒ වුණාට ඉතින් startup එකක් වගේ ගත්තොත් එහෙම ගොඩක් අය කරන්නේ on-premises තියාගන්නේ. තේරුමක් නැහැ නේ යන විදිහට on-premises data center එකක් හදන්න සාමාන්‍යයෙන් ඉතින් හරියට හදනවා නම් කෝටියක් විතර යනවනේ. අර fireproof දික්ටි දාලා උඩින් යටින් AC ගහලා temperature maintain කරලා access control කරලා ඔක්කොම එනකොට කෝටියක් විතර යනවා infrastructure එක හදන්න. ඊට පස්සේ servers එකත් storage controller එකක් 3 million විතර. blade server එකක් chassis එකක් 3 million විතර blade servers එකකට 6 million. කෝටි දෙකක තුනක project එකක් වෙන්න පුළුවන් data center එකක්. ඉතින් ඊට වඩා ගොඩක් වෙලාවට ලාභයි startup එකක් නම් මේ කෙලින්ම cloud එකට යන්නේ. අනිත් ඔය ලොකු organizations banks ඊට පස්සේ ඔය finance institutes යගන්නවා මේ hybrid cloud එක. hybrid environment. Everything depend on companies financial ability එකයි requirements යනවා.
මේ ඉන්ටර්න් යනවා කියලා මේ data centers වලට දෙන්නේ නැහැ නේද? ඉන්ටර්න් සාමාන්‍ය මුලින්
data centers වලටම දෙන්නේ නැහැ. කියන්නේ එහෙම සාමාන්‍ය data center officers කියලා කට්ටියක් නැහැ වෙනම. සාමාන්‍ය network engineers ලාම තමයි data center එකේ වැඩ කරන්නේ. එතකොට ඉතින් ඔය මොකක් හරි හොඳ company එක exposure එකක් තියෙන එක ඒකට ගියා නම් හරි. එහෙම නැත්නම් solutions දෙන company එකකට යන්න ඕනේ. කියන්නේ අපි ගමු දැන්
ඔය KBSL MIT වගේ යලා
ඔව් MIT හොඳ company එකක්. MIT එක තමයි අපේ Red Hat service බලන්නේ MIT එක. අපේ data center එක බලන්නේ VSIS එක. කියන අපේ support agreements එනවනේ. ඊට පස්සේ data service බලන්නේ Plexus කියලා company එකක්. ඒ වගේ ඉතින් තියෙනවා. ඒකට ඉතින් ඒ වගේ solutions දෙන company එකකට යන්න පුළුවන් නම් සෑහෙන වටිනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ ඒක උඩට clients ලා ගොඩක් එක්ක වැඩ කරන් ලැබෙනවා එක එක environments වල. ඒ exposure එක සෑහෙන වටිනවා. MIT, DMS, VSIS, ඊට පස්සේ Plexus, තාමනවත් තියෙනවා. EVs, ඔය companies වලින් තව තියෙනවා මේ ඔයගේ හොඳ company එකකට යන්න පුළුවන් නම් සෑහෙන වටිනවා. networking පැත්ත කරේ.
EVs එකේ වගේ පනගත්තොත් නම් networking සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අර hardware පැත්තත් එක්කත් ටිකක් අහු වෙනවා.
ඔව්.
කියලා දෙනවා.
ඒ EVs එකට වඩා හොඳයි MIT හරි DMS හරි යන්න පුළුවන්. අපි කාට හරි වුවම රෙකමන්ඩ් කරන්නේ මේ කර දෙයක් ගන්නොත් අපි DMS හරි අසයින්මන්ට් එකේ එක ප්‍රශ්නයක වචන 2000ක් නෙමෙයි ඔක්කොටම වචන 2000 ඔක්කොම මේ ප්‍රශ්න තුනටම වචන 2000ක් තමයි ඕනේ 2000 right so any more questions right then shall we wind up the session
Okay, sir.
right thank you everyone have a good night
Okay, thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Stay safe, sir.